My husband once told me, "From now on, I'll dictate when we speak or see each other. Stop following me around." And honestly, I can't imagine how I ever sank low enough to marry you. You've never been, and you never will be, anywhere near my league. So I stopped. 2 weeks of silence later, he showed up at my job, begging for the woman he was so certain he had destroyed. To be frank, I can't fathom how I ever stooped so low as to marry you. You have never been, nor will you ever be, anywhere close to my league. My husband, Mark, laid out those exact words for me on a Tuesday evening in October. I was standing in our dining room, wearing the very dress I had chosen to celebrate my Golden Apple Educator Award. He had walked in 3 hours late for the celebratory dinner I had so meticulously planned, cast a brief look at the table set with our wedding china, and bathed in the soft light of candles, and then delivered what he clearly considered a long overdue update to our marriage vows. From this point forward, he announced, he would be the one to decide when we conversed or spent time together. I was to stop trailing after him like some desperate little puppy. He then compared our incomes as if a person's worth could be tallied on a spreadsheet. My $52,000 a year as a third-grade teacher versus his impending partnership at a top-tier law firm. The verdict was in. We were simply not equals. Then he strode right past me, disappeared into his study, and shut the door, leaving me standing there with the cooling steak and the flickering candlelight. I didn't cry. I didn't beg or pound on his study door demanding an explanation. Instead, I felt a cold, sharp certainty take shape inside me, like ice forming on a window pane in the dead of winter. If my husband wanted silence and distance, if he truly believed marrying me was an act of lowering his standards, then I would give him exactly what he had asked for. I would do it with such complete devotion that in 2 weeks, he would be standing in the lobby of my school, clutching a bouquet of roses and pleading for the woman he was so convinced he had broken. Before we dive deeper, I want to thank you for being here, for sharing in stories of resilience and reclaiming one's self-worth. If you believe that no one should ever be told they are beneath their partner, please consider subscribing. It's free and helps us reach more people who need to hear these stories. Now, let's watch as Chloe's powerful transformation unfolds. But I should back up and explain how we got to that cliff edge, because the poison of that evening didn't just appear out of nowhere. It had been seeping into our marriage for months, a series of small injuries I kept making excuses for, rationalizing every cut until they formed a wound too deep to ignore. I had spent the entire afternoon on that dinner, pouring my attention into every last detail. The steak was seared, just as Mark's mother had shown me during the early months of our marriage, back when she was less open about her doubts, when she still pretended I was a good enough match for her son. The roasted potatoes were crispy, seasoned with the perfect amount of rosemary and garlic. I had driven to 3 different liquor stores to find the specific Merlot he liked, the kind that went for $50 a bottle and took a significant bite out of my weekly grocery budget. I set the table with the wedding china we saved for special events, pieces we had received as gifts 3 years earlier from relatives who thought they were investing in a marriage that would last a lifetime. The candles were the expensive, smokeless kind, placed in the crystal holders we had put on our registry but rarely used. This dinner was supposed to mean something. After 6 years of teaching third grade, of pouring my heart into helping 8-year-olds learn to read, write sentences, and view the world with curiosity, I had been named the Golden Apple Educator for my school district. The award came with a small cash prize that I had already mentally put toward the student loans I was still paying off, the same loans I had taken out to get us through Mark's brutal final year of law school, when money was so tight I had to work 2 jobs just to keep us afloat. But more than the money, the award was a form of validation. It was proof that the work I dedicated my life to mattered, that the endless hours, the emotional toll, and the genuine love I brought to my classroom were seen and appreciated. I desperately wanted to share that victory with my husband. I wanted Mark to look at me the way he used to, back in our first year together, when he would introduce me at firm events with his hand on the small of my back, telling his colleagues I was the best thing that had ever happened to him. I wanted him to be proud of me, just as I had been proud of him when he graduated at the top of his class, when he passed the bar exam with flying colors, when he won his first big case, and when the senior partner started talking about him as future partner material, despite his young age, 6:30 came and went. The only word from Mark had been a text at 5 o'clock saying he would be home by 6:30. I kept checking my phone, watching the minutes bleed into an hour, then 2. 7 o'clock passed, then 8. The steak was staying warm in the oven, but its perfect crust was getting soft. The potatoes were losing their crisp. The candles had burned down by an inch. I sent him 2 texts asking if he was okay, if he was still planning to come home for dinner. Neither got a reply. By 9 o'clock, my worry had soured into resignation. This was not the first time Mark had been hours late without any explanation or apology. Over the last 6 months, it had become a pattern I kept trying to justify. He was under a lot of pressure at work. The partnership review was taking up all his time. Important clients needed his attention at a moment's notice. Big cases required late nights at the office. I repeated these excuses to myself, building intricate defenses for behavior that, deep down, I knew was just plain disrespect disguised as professional ambition. When the front door finally opened at 9:30, I stood up from the dining room table where I had been waiting in the dimming candlelight. A small irrational spark of hope ignited in my chest. Maybe he would apologize. Maybe he would see the effort I had put in. Maybe we could still salvage some part of the evening. Mark walked in, wearing one of his designer suits, his tie already loose, his attention completely fixed on his phone screen. He didn't look up as he came in. He didn't see the table set for a celebration, or smell the dinner I had kept warm, or even notice the candles still bravely flickering. He just walked past the dining room, heading for his home office, his thumbs moving across his phone in that constant motion that had become more familiar to me than his touch. I moved to cut him off, stepping into the hallway before he could disappear into his sanctuary and lock me out. The words came tumbling out of me, bright and eager in a way that now makes me cringe. I told him about the award, about being named the Golden Apple Educator, about the gala where I would be honored. My voice was full of hope and a desperate need for him to care, to acknowledge this achievement, to give me even the smallest sign that my accomplishments meant something to him. Mark held up a hand, not even looking at me. That small, dismissive gesture was somehow more painful than anything he said next. It was the way you would silence someone interrupting an important phone call, the way you would wave away a waiter trying to refill your water when you were deep in a real conversation. He stopped in the hall and finally raised his eyes from his phone. I saw his expression register not pride or even curiosity, but pure annoyance that I had stopped him from doing whatever he considered more important. What he said next was delivered in the tone he probably used with opposing lawyers when delivering bad news, clinical, precise, and completely empty of warmth. He told me we needed to establish some new ground rules for our marriage. The phrase sounded rehearsed, as if he had been practicing this speech on his commute, or maybe for weeks. From this point on, he would decide when we spoke or spent time together. I needed to stop following him around like a desperate puppy begging for a scrap of attention. It was, he said, exhausting, and frankly, beneath both of us. He paused, and I watched him undo his tie with one hand while the other still held his phone. He hadn't stopped looking at the screen, as if he couldn't spare his full attention even for the task of dismantling our marriage. Then came the part that would play on a loop in my mind during the sleepless nights to come, the words that would define everything that came after. He said he couldn't imagine how he had ever sunk so low as to marry me, that I was never and would never be anywhere near his league. He laid it out with the cold logic of a lawyer presenting evidence. I was a third-grade teacher, making $52,000 a year. He was about to make partner at one of the city's most prestigious law firms, with an income that would soon be at least triple mine. We were not equals, he declared, and he was done pretending we were. The comparison was presented as an undeniable fact, as if my value as a human being could be accurately measured by comparing our W-2s and finding mine lacking. Then he walked past me, went into his office, and closed the door. The sharp click of the latch echoed through our home with a terrible finality. I stood there in the hallway, trapped between the dining room and his office, unable to move, my mind trying to process what had just happened. From behind that closed door, I could hear the muffled sound of his voice on the phone, probably with a colleague or a client, conducting business that was more important than the wife he had just emotionally destroyed. I walked slowly back to the dining room and looked at everything I had prepared. The steak on our wedding china, now cold and unappealing. The potatoes that had lost their perfect crisp. The expensive wine, opened and breathing on the table. The candles burning low in their crystal holders. It all looked different, transformed by his words from a celebration into a museum exhibit of my own naive hope and fundamental inadequacy. This was what happened when someone making $52,000 a year dared to think she was worthy of recognition or celebration or even basic human decency from someone about to make partner. That night, I didn't cry. That fact would surprise me later, because tears seemed like the only logical response to your husband declaring your marriage a personal failure on his part. But instead of grief, I felt something else rise up, uninvited. It was cold, clear, and absolutely ruthless, like water freezing into solid ice, or steel being hardened in a fire. The man I had married, whose name I shared, whom I had supported through law school by working 2 jobs and taking on debt and sacrificing my own financial security, had just told me I would never be good enough, that my worth could be plotted on a graph comparing our salaries and social standing, that our marriage was an act of his charity, not a partnership of equals. I stood in that dining room, staring at the closed office door, and I made a decision. If Mark wanted silence, if he wanted to be the sole judge of our communication, if he truly believed I was so far beneath him, then I would give him exactly that. I would honor his request with such perfect execution that he would eventually understand the catastrophic mistake he had just made. I would respect his boundaries so completely that he would finally see what his life truly looked like. Without the invisible support I had provided, for 3 years I moved through the dining room like someone performing a familiar ritual for the very last time. I cleared the table, wrapped the uneaten steak in foil, and put it in the fridge, where it would stay untouched until I threw it away days later. I blew out the candles, watching the thin ribbons of smoke rise toward the ceiling. I put away the wedding china piece by piece, wondering if we would ever use it again and already knowing the answer. I took the bottle of expensive Merlot and poured it down the kitchen sink, watching the deep red liquid swirl away. $50 gone, a fitting symbol for the evening, and perhaps for our entire marriage. Then I went upstairs, not to our bedroom, but to the guest room, and closed that door, setting my own boundary in response to his. Sleep didn't come that night, but a plan began to take shape. I lay in that unfamiliar bed, staring at the ceiling, and started to map out my next moves with a surprising clarity. Even with the shock still vibrating through me, Mark had just unintentionally given me a priceless gift. He had given me permission to stop trying, permission to stop walking on eggshells around his moods, permission to stop being the only one in our marriage who seemed to care if it survived. He had set the new rules of engagement, and I would follow them with such perfect obedience that he would eventually understand exactly what he had lost. The next morning, I was up before the sun, moving through our home with a new sense of purpose. I went to the kitchen and made coffee, but only a single cup. I made breakfast, but only a portion for one. When Mark came out of our bedroom around 7, adjusting his cufflinks and scrolling through his phone, he stopped in the kitchen doorway, a flicker of confusion on his face. It was quick, but it was there. For 3 years, without fail, I had made his breakfast every morning, his egg white omelet with perfectly diced bell peppers, his whole wheat toast, his coffee, made just the way he liked it, with 1 sugar and a splash of milk. The routine was so established that he'd stopped noticing it, had come to expect it the way you expect a light to come on when you flip a switch. I sat at the kitchen island with my coffee and my own simple bowl of oatmeal, and I looked at him directly. I told him I assumed he'd prefer to handle his own meals from now on, given his obvious capabilities and my apparent failure to meet his standards, making my domestic services no longer necessary. The words came out politely, with no anger or sarcasm, which seemed to throw him off even more than the missing breakfast. Mark opened his mouth, as if to argue, then seemed to think better of it. He grabbed his briefcase from the counter, where I would normally have put it next to his dry cleaning ticket, and a note about whatever errand he'd asked me to run that day. None of those things were there now. He stood for a moment, looking around the kitchen as if searching for something he couldn't quite place, then walked toward the door. I watched him go without offering the usual goodbye kiss, without reminding him of his afternoon conference call, without asking what time he'd be home. The door clicked shut behind him, and I sat alone in the quiet kitchen with my coffee. The silence no longer felt heavy or tense. Instead, it felt full of possibility. It felt like freedom. That first day of my strategic withdrawal was harder than I'd anticipated, though not for the reasons you might think. I didn't miss Mark. I didn't feel lonely or sad or regretful about my choice to give him the very silence he'd demanded. The challenge was in breaking 3 years of deeply ingrained habits, actions that had become as automatic as breathing. My body had been conditioned to operate in a certain way, and now I was telling it to unlearn everything. I was at my desk during morning recess while my 3rd graders were outside, their shouts echoing from the playground. My phone was on the desk next to my planner. I caught my hand reaching for it without a conscious thought, my thumb hovering over the screen to open my messaging app. Muscle memory was about to type out the usual text, asking Mark how his morning was going, or if he needed me to pick up anything on my way home. I stopped myself just before my thumb touched the screen, pulling my hand back as if the phone had suddenly become scorching hot. This happened again during my planning period, and again while my students were at lunch. Each time I had to consciously fight the impulse that had been built up by thousands of repetitions over 3 years. I decided to redirect that energy. I picked up my phone and texted my sister, Sophie, instead, asking if she wanted to grab dinner that week. We hadn't spent any real time together in months because I always seemed to have some task to do for Mark. Sophie replied almost immediately, her message filled with enthusiasm and 3 exclamation points, saying she'd been worried about me and would love to catch up. Then I messaged my friend Jenna, whom I'd been neglecting because Mark always seemed to need something during the evenings, when I might have otherwise kept up with my friendships. Jenna wrote back saying she thought I'd fallen off the face of the planet and suggested we get drinks on Friday. I even replied to an email from Brenda, the 5th grade teacher down the hall whose lunch invitations I had politely turned down at least a dozen times, because I was always rushing home to make sure Mark had a proper meal waiting for him. When I finally walked into the teacher's lounge that afternoon with my lunch, Brenda looked up from her salad with genuine surprise. She'd been sitting alone at one of the small tables, grading papers as she ate, and her face lit up when she saw me. I asked if the seat was taken, and she immediately made room. We talked about nothing important. Brenda told me about a trip to Mexico she was planning for spring break, showing me pictures of the resort on her phone. She complained about a difficult parent-teacher conference she was dreading, with a father who refused to believe his son needed extra help with math. She shared her thoughts on the principal's new, questionable policies about standardized test prep. As we talked, I realized how much I'd missed this. Simple, easy conversation with another adult about things that had nothing to do with managing Mark's needs, or predicting his moods, or making sure his life ran like a well-oiled machine. Brenda asked how my week was going, and I found myself telling her about the Golden Apple Award. Her reaction was everything Mark's should have been. She grabbed my arm and let out a little squeal of delight, saying I absolutely deserved it and that she'd always thought I was one of the most dedicated teachers in the school. We spent the rest of our lunch break talking about the awards ceremony, what I should wear, and whether I'd have to give a speech. When the bell rang, signaling the end of lunch, I felt lighter, as if the simple act of being seen and celebrated by someone who genuinely cared had released a pressure I hadn't even known I was carrying. By day 3, something had fundamentally changed. I woke up that morning and went through my routine of showering, dressing, and getting ready for work. And somewhere around the time I was brushing my teeth, I realized I hadn't thought about Mark even once. I hadn't wondered when he would be home. I hadn't mentally reviewed his schedule to anticipate his needs. I hadn't checked my phone for messages from him. The realization stopped me mid-brush. For the first time in 3 years, Mark wasn't the background program constantly running in my mind. At school that day, I taught my students about the water cycle with real focus. We did an experiment with ice, hot plates, and a glass lid to show evaporation and condensation, and I found myself completely in the moment, not mentally planning dinner or worrying if I had forgotten some task for Mark. During recess, I helped settle a dispute between 2 girls arguing over the swings, and I handled it with a patient humor that had been missing for months. I planned the next week's lessons without once looking at my phone to see if Mark had texted. The mental space that had been taken up by managing his life was suddenly free. I felt physically lighter, as if I had been carrying a heavy backpack for so long I had forgotten how it felt to walk without the weight. During my lunch break with Brenda, I actually tasted my sandwich instead of just mechanically chewing. While my brain was somewhere else, I noticed the crispness of the lettuce, the sharp flavor of the mustard, the sweetness of the iced tea I'd brought. Brenda noticed the change before I fully did. She tilted her head as she watched me and said, "I seem different." Lighter was the word she used. She asked if something good had happened, and I just told her I was making a few adjustments in my life. She didn't push, but she gave me a knowing smile, the kind that says she understood that sometimes the most positive changes come from finally letting go of what's been holding you down. The transformation picked up speed with each passing day, like a snowball rolling downhill. I started going to the gym before school, a habit I'd given up because Mark used to complain that I was never home in the mornings. The complaint never made sense, since he left for work before 6 and wouldn't have noticed I was gone. But I'd stopped going, weighed down by the guilt his criticism caused. Now, I reclaimed that routine. I drove to the gym at 5:30, spent 45 minutes on the elliptical and with weights, and got to school feeling energized instead of drained. I reconnected with old friends I had let drift away. Jenna and I met for drinks on Friday at a downtown wine bar, and we talked for 3 hours without me once checking my phone for messages from Mark. My college friend Melissa invited me to a weekend brunch, and I accepted without the automatic mental calculation of whether Mark might need me to be around. These friendships had faded because Mark always seemed to need something. During the very hours I might have used to nurture connections outside our marriage, I hadn't realized how isolated I'd become until I started rebuilding those bridges. On Wednesday evening of the second week, I did something I'd wanted to do for years. I signed up for a painting class at the local art center. The class met every Wednesday from 6 to 8, a time I would normally have spent making elaborate meals that Mark barely noticed. I walked into the studio feeling a mix of nerves and excitement, and was greeted by Eleanor, the instructor. She looked to be in her late 60s, with a shock of white hair and paint stains permanently on her hands. She had the kind of wise, kind face that suggested she had navigated her own share of life's storms and come out stronger. Eleanor welcomed me warmly and showed me to an easel in the corner. She showed me how to mix colors on a palette, her hands moving with a practiced, confident grace. My first attempt at a still life was a disaster, a muddy mess of colors that looked nothing like the fruit in the bowl. Eleanor just laughed kindly and said that's where everyone starts. She said learning to paint required patience and a willingness to fail spectacularly before anything beautiful could be created. Then she shared a piece of her story she'd been teaching art for 20 years, she said, after a painful divorce had forced her to rebuild her life from scratch. She had needed something that was entirely hers, something no one could criticize, diminish, or take away from her. Painting became that for her. She looked at me with eyes that seemed to see more than I was saying and told me that sometimes the best things we create are born from the wreckage of what we thought we wanted. Her words felt like a quiet blessing. I worked on my canvas for the rest of the class, and while nothing I made was remotely good enough to display, I felt something shifting inside me. I was building something new from the ruins of my marriage, and it was going to be entirely mine. On day 7, I took a step that felt both terrifying and necessary. During my lunch break, I drove to a credit union across town, one Mark would never have any reason to visit. I walked in, my heart pounding, and asked to speak with someone about opening a new account. A young woman, looking like she was fresh out of college, walked me through the process with professional discretion, never once asking why I needed an account separate from my husband. I opened a checking account solely in my name and arranged for a portion of my paycheck to be automatically deposited into it. Small amounts that Mark would never notice were missing. I was building a financial lifeboat, one that existed completely outside his knowledge or control. That same week, I scheduled a consultation with a divorce attorney. I found Isabel Thorne through an online search for lawyers specializing in high-asset divorces, particularly cases where one spouse had a much higher income. Her office was in a downtown high-rise that smelled of expensive leather and quiet power. Isabel listened to my story with the focused intensity of a predator sizing up its prey, taking precise notes as I spoke. She asked detailed questions about our finances, about the student loans I had taken out to support us through Mark's law school years, about the 2 jobs I had worked while he studied for the bar. Isabel explained that in our state, his upcoming partnership and the huge salary increase that came with it would be considered marital property, subject to equitable division, especially since I had directly supported his education and early career. When she smiled at this fact, it wasn't a kind smile. It was the smile of someone who knew exactly how to make Mark regret every last condescending word he had ever said to me. I left her office with a clear plan and a timeline. For the first time since that horrible Tuesday night, I felt a flicker of something that felt like hope. The changes in Mark started to become noticeable around day 10. They were subtle at first, but they built up into a pattern I couldn't have ignored even if I'd wanted to. I began to notice things during the brief moments our paths crossed in the house we technically still shared. He would come out of the bedroom in the morning looking disoriented, moving through the kitchen with the confused air of someone in an unfamiliar place. I could hear him opening and closing cabinets, the sounds broken up by long pauses that suggested he was trying to remember where things were, or perhaps wondering why they weren't where he expected them to be. His favorite coffee mug sat unused on the shelf. For 3 years, that mug had been waiting for him every morning, filled with coffee made exactly to his liking. 1 sugar, a splash of milk, the temperature just right. Now, it gathered dust while I used my own mug and made only enough for myself. I would stand at the counter making my breakfast and watch from the corner of my eye as he opened the cabinet, saw the empty mug, and shut the door again without taking it out. He never asked me to make him coffee. He never even mentioned the absence of this long-standing ritual. But I could see the confusion in his posture, the way he would linger for a few extra seconds as if waiting for something to appear on its own. The dry cleaning became another point of visible confusion. Every Thursday for 3 years, I had picked up his dress shirts and suits from the cleaners on my way home from school. The timing was perfect, as the cleaner was on my route, and Mark always had evening meetings or court dates that required freshly pressed clothes. Now, his shirts hung in the cleaner's storage, yellow tickets still attached, unclaimed because I no longer considered his wardrobe my responsibility. On Thursday evening of the second week, I overheard him on the phone with the dry cleaner, his voice a mix of annoyance and confusion as he asked about his order and why his clothes hadn't been picked up. The kitchen told its own story of neglect. The groceries I used to buy and carefully organize according to his tastes were gone, replaced by items that I wanted. I bought the snacks I enjoyed, the breakfast foods that were easy to prepare for one, the ingredients for simple meals I could make quickly. After a long day, Mark would open the refrigerator and just stand there, staring at the contents as if they were written in a foreign language. He was looking for the prepped ingredients for his favorite dishes, the specific brand of Greek yogurt he liked. None of it was there. I would walk past him during these moments of confusion without a word, maintaining the pleasant but distant manner you might use with a roommate you barely knew, not a husband. When our paths crossed in the hall, I'd offer a polite smile and keep moving. If we were in the kitchen at the same time, I'd prepare my food and eat it without starting a conversation beyond a bland comment about the weather or a reminder that trash day was Friday one evening. Near the end of that second week, Mark actually broke the silence I had so carefully maintained. I was in the living room reading a novel I'd picked up from the library, a thriller about a woman who systematically dismantled her abusive ex-husband's life through meticulous planning. Mark came out of his office around 8 and stood in the doorway, watching me for a moment. His voice, when he finally asked if everything was all right, had a trace of uncertainty I'd never heard from him before. It was hesitant, almost fragile, completely unlike the confident, booming voice he used for everything else. I looked up from my book and gave him the same pleasant, distant smile I'd been practicing. I assured him everything was perfectly fine. I was just respecting his boundaries and giving him the space he had requested. I reminded him that he had said he would decide when we communicated, so I was simply waiting for his decision. The logic was flawless, impossible to argue with. How could he possibly complain that I was giving him exactly what he had demanded? He stood there a moment longer, as if trying to find a loophole in my argument. His mouth opened slightly, then closed again. Finally, he just nodded and went back into his office. I returned to my book, feeling a small, sharp thrill of satisfaction. The trap I had laid was working perfectly. Day 12 brought a development that confirmed my strategy was hitting its mark. My phone rang during my lunch break while I was in the teacher's lounge with Brenda and 2 other colleagues. We were discussing an upcoming field trip, debating the pros and cons of a guided tour versus letting the students explore on their own. When Mark's name flashed on my screen, I glanced at it and declined the call without missing a beat in our conversation. I went back to my sandwich and continued discussing field trip logistics as if nothing had happened. Brenda caught my eye and gave me a slight, questioning arch of her eyebrow, but she said nothing. She knew enough to understand what that declined call meant, and the look she gave me was one of silent approval. After lunch, as we walked back to our classrooms, she squeezed my arm and whispered, "You're doing great." She didn't need to say more. That evening, my phone rang again while I was at my painting class. My hands were covered in acrylics as I worked on a landscape that was actually starting to look like something. I saw Mark's name on the screen. Without breaking my focus, I ignored it and kept painting. Eleanor noticed the call and my deliberate choice to let it go unanswered. She gave me a small, approving nod, the kind of silent acknowledgement that passes between women who understand what it takes to ignore a ringing phone after years of being conditioned to jump at its every command. Over the next 2 days, Mark called 6 more times. I didn't answer a single one. Each rejected call felt like reclaiming a tiny piece of myself I had given away without even realizing it was a transaction. Wednesday afternoon, Thursday morning, Thursday evening, Friday at noon, Friday evening, Saturday morning. The calls kept coming, and I kept declining them with a growing sense of empowerment. I wasn't being cruel. I was simply enforcing the rules he himself had established. He was the one who would decide when we communicated, and apparently, his calls didn't count. On day 14, the calls stopped and the texts began. The first arrived during my planning period. It was short, polite. "Are you okay?" I read it and put my phone down. The second came an hour later, expressing confusion about why I wasn't answering his calls or texts. The third that evening carried a new tone, frustration seeping through the carefully chosen words he wrote, that he didn't understand what was happening, that we needed to talk, that my silence was making things worse. I read each message and then deleted it. What could I possibly say that wouldn't shatter the perfect, unassailable logic of my position? He had told me to stop bothering him, so he had said he would decide when we communicated, so I was waiting. The fact that his attempts to initiate contact didn't qualify as a decision was a nuance he clearly hadn't considered when he laid down his new law. By the end of the second week, the physical evidence of Mark's unraveling was undeniable. He had stopped eating proper meals, a fact I could deduce from the growing pile of takeout containers in the kitchen trash, pizza boxes, Chinese food cartons, fast food bags. The man who used to demand a home-cooked meal every night was now subsisting on whatever he could have delivered. His expensive dress shirts were fitting more loosely around his collar and shoulders, visible proof that he was losing weight from stress and poor nutrition. The dark circles under his eyes told their own story of sleepless nights, likely spent wondering how his perfectly curated life had suddenly veered off script. I knew he was up at all hours. I could hear him pacing in his office at 3 a.m, the floorboards groaning under his restless steps. His meticulously maintained appearance, so crucial to the image of a successful attorney he projected, was starting to show cracks. I noticed a coffee stain on his tie one morning, a small blemish he never would have tolerated back when I was managing the minutiae of his life. His hair often looked uncombed, and his jaw frequently sported a stubble that suggested he'd skipped shaving. The man who told me I would never be on his level was getting a harsh lesson in what his level actually looked like without the invisible support system I had provided for 3 years. Every detail I had managed, every task I had handled without being asked, every convenience I had arranged had vanished. And I have to admit, watching him struggle with the basic upkeep of his own life brought me a grim satisfaction I hadn't anticipated. What Mark didn't know, what he could never have predicted because he had always so thoroughly underestimated me, was that I was documenting everything. While he was falling apart, I was building an airtight case. I kept a detailed journal, hidden in my car, recording every dismissive comment, every canceled plan, every instance of casual cruelty. The pages were filling up with evidence. I had copies of our financial records on a thumb drive that Isabel had instructed me to keep somewhere safe. The records clearly showed how much of my income had gone towards supporting his career, while my own student loans languished. I had screenshots of texts where he'd brushed off my concerns as unimportant. I even had a recording from our last attempt at marriage counseling, the one he'd refused to attend, where the therapist had noted his absence for her official records. Isabel had reviewed it all with the sharp eye of an attorney preparing for battle. She assured me it painted a clear picture of neglect and emotional abuse that would play very well in court, especially given that his partnership was about to make him substantially wealthier. The revenge I was constructing wasn't hot and impulsive. It was cold, methodical, and built with the same careful attention to detail I gave to everything I did well. Day 15 was a Friday afternoon, buzzing with the typical end-of-week energy of an elementary school. My students had been dismissed, and I was in my classroom organizing materials for the following week when the principal's voice crackled over the intercom. She asked me to come to the main office, and the request had an unusual edge that made my heart quicken. My mind immediately leaped to worst-case scenarios as I hurried down the hall. Had something happened to my parents? Was Sophie okay? The hallways were decorated with colorful student art. construction paper pumpkins and autumn leaves that usually made me smile, but now, just blurred past, I passed the library, where afternoon story time was in session, and the gymnasium, where the rhythmic thud of a kickball game echoed. When I reached the main office, I looked through the glass window before entering, and my breath hitched. Mark was standing in the lobby. He was wearing one of his most expensive suits, the charcoal gray one he reserved for major client meetings. In his hands, he held a ridiculously large bouquet of roses, at least 3 dozen, wrapped in crinkling cellophane. He looked utterly out of place amidst the controlled chaos of dismissal time. Parents were collecting children, backpacks were being slung over shoulders, and conversations were happening at a dozen different volumes. Mark stood in the middle of it all, looking lost and desperate. Mrs. Gable, the school secretary, sat behind her desk, and when she caught my eye, her expression conveyed a world of information without a single word. There was sympathy, but also a healthy dose of curiosity about what, exactly, was unfolding in her lobby. I saw other staff members trying not to stare while absolutely staring. My colleague Sarah was pretending to check her mailbox, but hadn't moved in a full minute. Tom, the gym teacher, had paused just outside the office door with a stack of cones in his arms. I took a deep breath and felt a sense of calm settle over me. It wasn't just calm, it was clarity mixed with a steely purpose. I straightened my shoulders, a gesture that felt like donning armor, and walked into the lobby. Mark's face lit up with relief the moment he saw me, quickly followed by a desperate hope. He took a step toward me, and I noticed the signs of strain up close. The suit was immaculate, but his face was haggard. The dark circles under his eyes were more pronounced than they had been just a few days ago. He started talking before I could say a word, the words tumbling out in an uncharacteristic jumble. Mark made his living with his articulate, controlled arguments, but right now he sounded like an actor who had forgotten all his lines. He said he'd been trying to reach me for days, that he'd been calling and texting, and didn't understand why I wasn't responding. He thrust the roses toward me as if they were a magical amulet that could undo the last 2 weeks. He explained that he'd been under tremendous stress with the partnership review, that he'd said things he didn't really mean. He suggested we go to dinner that night at our old favorite Italian place, a restaurant we hadn't visited in over a year because he was always too busy. He talked about reconnecting, about working through this, about how much he missed me. He said he missed us, as if us had recently been a functioning partnership rather than a one-sided arrangement of my giving and his taking. The performance was transparently desperate. I could see the lawyer's mind at work, trying to find the right combination of phrases to compel the response he wanted. But I also saw something else, genuine bewilderment that his usual tactics weren't working. Mark was used to winning. He expected that showing up with expensive flowers and the right apologies would solve this problem, just like any other. I stood there looking at him as the ambient noise of the lobby gradually faded. Several teachers had now stopped what they were doing and were watching with open fascination. Mrs. Gable had abandoned all pretense of work. A group of students waiting for their parents had gone silent, sensing with that uncanny intuition of children that something important was happening. When I finally spoke, my voice was clear and carried easily through the quiet lobby. I was surprised by how steady I sounded. I told Mark that he had laid out very clear ground rules for our marriage 2 weeks ago. He had stated that he would be the one to decide when we talked. He had told me to stop chasing him. What was happening right now, I explained, was not him deciding we should talk. This was him deciding he wanted to talk, which was a completely different thing. I told him he wanted me to be available on his terms, to come running the moment he felt the slightest discomfort from the consequences of his own actions. And that, I said, was not how this worked anymore. My voice remained calm and even, but each word was a carefully placed stone in a wall he could not breach. I wasn't being emotional. I was simply following the logical path he himself had paved. Mark blinked, and I saw genuine confusion cloud his features. In his world, people didn't say no to him. His confusion quickly soured into anger. I saw the shift in his posture, the tightening of his jaw. His voice, when he spoke again, had an edge that made a few of the watching children shrink back. He said I was his wife, his tone implying this fact alone obligated my compliance. He said I couldn't just ignore him for 2 weeks, as if he didn't exist. He called what I was doing manipulative, and then he accused me of emotional abuse. The absurdity of the accusation was so staggering that I actually laughed. The sound surprised me as much as it did him. It was a genuine laugh of disbelief. Here was a man who had told me I would never be on his level, who had called our marriage an act of charity on his part, and who had demanded I stop bothering him. And now he stood in my workplace, accusing me of emotional abuse for doing exactly as he'd asked. I told him I was following his instructions to the letter. He had requested I stop chasing him, so I had. He had established that he would determine when we communicated, so I was waiting. He had told me I was beneath him, so I was respecting his superior judgment by keeping my distance. The logic was airtight, and I delivered it with the same cool precision he had used on me. Several teachers were now watching openly. Sarah was standing with her arms crossed, as if she were watching a captivating TV show. Tom had set down his cones and was leaning against the wall. I saw my principal, Dr. Evans, emerge from her office, her expression a mix of concern and, I thought, something that looked almost like approval. Mark stood there, holding his wilting roses, visibly trying to find an angle, an argument, some way to regain control. His mouth opened and closed a few times, but no words came. His voice dropped to an almost pleading tone I had never heard from him. He asked what I wanted from him. The question itself was a revelation of how little he understood. This wasn't a negotiation with a list of demands. He started offering concessions, as if he were in a deposition. He called himself a jerk. He admitted he'd been stressed and taken it out on me. He acknowledged he'd said things he shouldn't have. Each admission was carefully phrased, and I could see him scanning my face for any sign that his strategy was working. He suggested we go somewhere private to talk, as if privacy would magically erase his cruelty. I looked at him, and I realized with profound certainty that I was looking at a stranger. This person genuinely believed the right combination of words and gestures could reset everything. He thought he could perform just enough contrition, and I would slot back into my role of supporting his life while he offered nothing but contempt in return. The word that came from my mouth was simple and final. No, I wasn't going to dinner with him. We were not going to talk. I was going to finish my work, go home to my apartment, and enjoy a peaceful weekend. I made sure to emphasize that last part. My apartment, not our house. An apartment I had found and rented without his knowledge or permission. I suggested he leave, go back to his office, and start getting used to what his life looked like without me managing every single detail of it. My voice remained steady. I wasn't emotional. I was just stating facts. The information about the apartment hit him with the force of a physical blow. He actually stumbled back a step. "Your apartment?" he repeated, his voice a choked whisper. His face cycled through confusion, disbelief, and then outright panic. He started protesting. "We lived together," he said. "I was his wife. I couldn't just move out without discussing it." He was invoking the rules of a game he had already declared over. I just looked at him and said, "Watch me." Then I turned and walked away, down the hallway toward my classroom. My sensible shoes squeaked softly on the polished linoleum. Behind me, I heard him call my name, his voice laced with a genuine panic that was utterly foreign to his usual controlled demeanor. He was beginning to grasp the full scope of what he had lost. But I didn't turn around. I didn't give him the satisfaction of a reaction. I just kept walking until I reached my classroom. I went inside, closed the door, and leaned against it, my heart finally pounding from the confrontation. The room was empty and peaceful. The walls were covered with inspirational posters about kindness and perseverance. concepts I taught my students every day while failing to demand them in my own life. My Golden Apple Award sat on my desk, a quiet testament to a value he could never comprehend. I sat down and took a deep breath. The adrenaline began to fade, replaced by something steadier. It felt like peace. I had real work here, real purpose. 24 third graders depended on me to teach them, guide them, and model what respect looked like. And I was good at this work in a way that had nothing to do with salary or status. My life was finally gloriously mine again, and it felt incredible. That weekend, I met with Isabel in her downtown office. She laid out the timeline like a general planning a campaign. By Monday morning, divorce papers would be delivered to Mark's office by a process server, known for his public flair. By Tuesday, I would have a new phone number. By Wednesday, I would meet a realtor to discuss selling the house. By Friday, I would sign the lease on a one-bedroom apartment in a renovated historic building downtown. Isabel reviewed the mountain of documentation I had gathered. The bank statements, the student loan papers, the records of my 2 jobs. She smiled that sharp, predatory smile again. She told me that Mark's impending partnership, the very thing he'd used to belittle me, would be my greatest asset. Since I had supported him through his lean years, I was entitled to a significant portion of his increased earning potential. She estimated I would walk away with enough to pay off my student loans entirely with a substantial cushion to start over. The satisfaction I felt wasn't about the money, it was about justice. Monday morning at 11:30, I received a text from Isabel. It contained a single word: delivered. I imagined Mark's face, the crack in his carefully composed facade as he was served divorce papers in front of the very partners he was so desperate to impress. The thought brought a satisfaction that was all about justice, not cruelty. That afternoon, I got a new phone number. Back at school, I blocked him on every social media platform. I was erasing him from my digital life as thoroughly as I was from my real one. Tuesday brought an unexpected complication. As I was dismissing my students, I saw Megan, Mark's sister, waiting for me. She looked disheveled and distressed. She pulled me aside and asked what was happening. Mark had called her in a panic, talking about divorce papers and me moving out. Megan admitted her brother could be difficult. But surely, she pleaded, we could work this out. I looked at Megan, and I decided she deserved the truth I told her, calmly and without embellishment, exactly what Mark had said to me. The part about him lowering himself to marry me, the part about me never being on his level, I watched her face fall. Then she told me something that shifted everything. She said Mark had been telling their family for months that our marriage was essentially over. He had been painting me as unambitious, someone holding him back. He was just waiting until after he made partner to leave me because the optics would be better. The revelation was a gut punch. He'd been so arrogant, so certain of my passive compliance, that he had already written the end of our story to his family while still expecting me to iron his shirts. The knowledge made his shock at my departure even more validating. He hadn't just taken me for granted. He had assumed I was an inanimate object in the stage play of his life. I thanked Megan for her honesty and made it clear my decision was final. Mark had shown me who he was, and I was finally believing him. By Wednesday, Mark had launched a social media campaign. My friend Jenna called me, reading his vague, philosophical posts about how marriage takes work and how some people just give up. He was crafting a narrative where he was the devoted, wounded husband. Jenna was furious on my behalf, but I just felt a cold amusement. It was so predictable. I told her the whole story, the exact words Mark had used. I gave her my blessing to share it with our mutual friends. I was done protecting his reputation. If he wanted to play the victim, people deserved to know the full story. I hung up the phone and looked around my new apartment. It was still filled with boxes, but it was mine, every inch of it. The systematic dismantling of my old life was proceeding exactly as planned, and I was building something new, something that would be entirely my own. 3 weeks after the papers were served, Mark showed up at my new apartment. It was a Saturday morning, and I was unpacking the last of my books. I heard a knock and saw him through the peephole. He looked terrible. He was holding 2 cups of coffee from my favorite local cafe. I opened the door but blocked the entrance with my body. This was my space, and he was not invited. He launched into a rehearsed speech. He'd been wrong. The pressure had made him say things he didn't mean. He was in therapy. He understood now how much I'd done for him. He wanted to prove he could be the husband I deserved. I listened patiently until he was done. Then I asked him a question. "Are you trying to reconcile because you love me?" I asked. "Or because your managing partners suggested a messy divorce right before your partnership decision might reflect poorly on your judgment?" The flicker of panic in his eyes told me everything before he even tried to deny it. He stammered that of course he loved me, but the denial was hollow. I told him Isabel had already briefed me on this possibility, that law firms dislike personal chaos. His sudden desire for reconciliation was just a little too convenient. I watched him deflate as he realized I had seen straight through him, that the woman he'd dismissed as simple had been 10 steps ahead all along. Then I told him that he had been right about one thing. We weren't on the same level, but he had the hierarchy all wrong. I explained that I spent my days teaching children to read, to think, to be kind. I shaped minds and added real value to the world. He, on the other hand, spent his days helping wealthy corporations avoid their responsibilities. His work paid well, but it created nothing of substance. My level, I said, was just fine. I was proud of my level, and I had no interest in descending to his. Where love was a transaction and marriage was a career move, I told him the divorce would proceed. I explained that I was entitled to a significant portion of his partnership bonus and the equity from the house, since I had financially supported his ascent. He would be learning a very expensive lesson about treating people like disposable assets. His face hardened. He made one last desperate play. His voice took on a sharp edge as he warned me that fighting the divorce would be long and costly. His firm's lawyers could make my life very difficult. It was a threat, and it confirmed everything I now knew about him. I smiled at him, the same calm smile from that first morning. I told him Isabel was hoping he'd fight. I had documentation of everything: the verbal abuse, the financial records, the recording from the therapy session he'd skipped. I explained that a messy public fight would be the very thing his firm would find most distasteful. It would create the exact optics he was so desperately trying to avoid. I watched the calculation happen behind his eyes. He was a lawyer. He understood risk. He knew he was trapped. He turned and walked away without another word. I watched him go, his shoulders slumped in defeat. When he was gone, I closed my door. I stood there for a moment, holding the expensive coffee he'd brought me. Then I walked to my kitchen and poured it down the sink. I didn't need his coffee, his apologies, or his pathetic attempts at reconciliation. I had everything I needed right here. 4 months later, the divorce was finalized in Isabel's conference room. Mark and I signed the papers in silence. The settlement was substantial, just as she had predicted. Enough to pay off my loans, a significant portion of his bonus, and half the equity from the house. He looked smaller, diminished. When it was over, I stood up, gathered my papers, and walked out into the afternoon sun without a backward glance. 6 months after that, I sat in my apartment, which now felt like a true home. My paintings from Eleanor's class adorned the walls. My books were arranged just so my life was filled with good friends, a fulfilling job, and a peaceful quiet that I cherished. My sister and I were closer than ever. One evening, Jenna called with some news from the legal world gossip mill. Mark's partnership had been deferred for at least a year. The firm's leadership had cited concerns about his judgment and stability during a personally difficult period. The very thing he had valued more than our marriage had been delayed because of how he had ended it. I thought I would feel a surge of triumph, but I felt nothing but a distant sense of cosmic balance. I told Jenna I was ready to stop hearing about Mark's life and focus completely on my own. The real revenge wasn't in his failure. The real revenge was my peace. It was waking up without a knot of anxiety in my stomach. It was the freedom to be myself. It was realizing that I had always been enough, and his inability to see that was his failing, not mine. I was a teacher who made a difference in the world. That was enough. It had always been enough. And if Mark ever truly understood what he had lost, it would be far too late. The woman he tried to break had built herself back, stronger and brighter than he could have ever imagined. And she was drinking her coffee exactly how she liked it, in a home that was entirely hers, on a Saturday morning that belonged to no one but herself. This story of calculated revenge and reclaimed power had you absolutely hooked. Smash that like button right now. My favorite part was when Chloe stood in that school lobby and calmly told Mark she had gotten her own apartment, watching his entire world crumble in real time. What was your favorite moment of her journey? Drop it in the comments below. Don't miss more powerful stories of strength and justice like this one. Subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload. End of story.